Okay, I think that's everything. Oh, we're live. Well, I guess that means we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Usually talks, I can see everybody. So this is actually one of the first times I feel like I'm speaking into a void. So here goes. We're just going to like pretend, right? It's like you're having a conversation with yourself in the mirror practicing at home. So this is the Science That Unsettles 4S Plenary Session number 1. I'm Kim Tallbear. I am a professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and I am Sistan Waptin Oyate, which is a Dakota Nation in what is currently North and South Dakota in the United States. So I'm going to do, you can go to the next slide, please, Ed. I'm going to do a land acknowledgement, land or place acknowledgement, and other speakers may do theirs as well. But it's up to them. We've talked a little bit about that, but here's mine. So I'm coming to you from Edmonton, which is, and I'm going to try to pronounce the Cree, Amiskwachi-Waskahagan, which means Beaver Hills House. And this is a picture. We're in Treaty 6 territory. So for those of you from outside of Canada, Edmonton is not too far from, say, Jasper or Banff. But as you can see by the very flat horizon in this picture, we're at the edge of the prairie where I am, and we are located in Treaty 6 territory. So-called Edmonton, or called Edmonton today, is for a long time traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, and Inuit people. And so the first peoples of these lands are not only artifacts of the past. So when I say that it's long been a traditional gathering place, it still is. This is a city with a vibrant Indigenous community and Indigenous institutions across the city. So I'm going to give you a little plenary overview. Dr. Shay-Akil McLean, who will be our second panelist to speak today, in his 2019 American Anthropologist essay, Social Problems, Structural Issues, and Unsettling Science, called for problem-centered analyses of racism and other artifacts of settler colonialism in ways that settle disciplinary and theoretical boundaries. So this is the first in a two-part plenary. Part 2 will air on Saturday, that highlights the approaches of diversely situated scholars. Both social and physical scientists will be on these panels. Their approaches to unsettling normative science that is rooted in colonial, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, heteropatriarchal, and ableist standpoints. That said, this is not an equity, diversity, and inclusion panel. This panel is not about diversifying the settler nation state and its capitalistic techno-scientific terrain. These plenaries challenge inherently bad relational practices that are rooted in irredeemable hierarchies of life instead of ideas like interdependence, as our first panelist, Amy Hamrie, details in their talk, Interdependence as a Political Relational Ontology. And I forgot to turn my phone down, so in case you did too, you can join me in silencing your phones. Plenary organizers first envisioned a single plenary session when we started organizing this, limited to Indigenous STS in North America, north of Mexico, where 4S 2021 is organized. Now, the idea was to highlight Indigenous STS as a burgeoning subfield that supports Indigenous peoples in our efforts to govern effectively through both Western science and traditional knowledge, while also disrupting that prevalent knowledge binary. Now, of course, we do get stuck working within these binary labels, science versus Indigenous knowledge, because in lands currently occupied by Canada and the US, we're largely stuck working in English. We live with the unfortunate legacies of forced conversions to English language, to Christianity, to settler state citizenship, as our own languages and ways of relating to the universe, both this and beyond, and to one another, were and continue to be violently suppressed by colonizers. Now, that said, in Indigenous STS, we advocate theorizing out of Indigenous languages and analytical frameworks, which we still retain to varying degrees. So you'll see some of that in these two plenaries, including in panelist number 3, I'm going to try to get your name right. Uahe- Aga- Oahikea Maile, his talk on anti-colonialism in space. That's the thing about working with a lot of diverse Indigenous peoples. You're always like working hard on the pronunciations. So after considering an Indigenous STS plenary only, organizers quickly decided on a two-part plenary and an expanded vision beyond Indigenous STS that recognizes that critical and unsettling analyses of science and technology and proposed interventions articulate between the multiple standpoints and intellectual genealogies that are reflected in these talks across these two plenaries. So the plenaries aim to stimulate more conversation at the metaphorical kitchen table around which Indigenous, feminist, Black, queer, and CRIP thinkers gather to tackle a variety of hierarchies in scientific knowledge production. So we hope that you will also join us on Saturday for the Unsettling Science Plenary 2, which will be chaired by Marissa Elena Duarte from Arizona State University. She is the author of the book Network Sovereignty. And that plenary number 2 will also feature panelists who work across Indigenous STS, CRIP technoscience, critical genomics, and Black feminist health science studies. So before introducing today's panelist, I just want to say a few more words about the idea of unsettling for better relating. Not unsettling for unsettling's sake, but toward better relating. So in yesterday's roundtable session that I attended here at this conference, it was called Biotechnologies and Body Interventions, Reorienting Research with Indigenous STS. The session chair, who was my University of Alberta colleague, Jessica Kalapenik, asked her fellow panelists, so what is Indigenous STS? And panelist responses included the kinds of ideas that sparked this more than Indigenous plenary. And I should say, those STS scholars, assistant professors, or PhD students who populated that panel, and it was really so affirming to listen to that. I learned a lot. So all 4 panelists, when asked that question, defined Indigenous STS as generated through critical Indigenous studies, which is been a quickly growing global field in the last 10 years. Now that means Indigenous STS is not actually about adding Indigenous content to STS and then you stir. I think that was a line I stole from Jessica Kalapenik. So evincing that critical Indigenous studies genealogy, all 4 of the panelists on yesterday's panel focused on relational analyses, again, also a theme of this year's annual meeting. So what would change, they asked, if our scientific and technological projects were approached differently through relationality versus stemming from often violent hierarchies of life? Like the panelists in these 2 plenaries, they noted an imperative to not only study science, but to change it, which is related to the idea expressed by University of Manitoba Native Studies scholar Marissa DeBorn, who explained that Indigenous STS reorients her away from a focus on Indigenous bodies and instead allows her to reorient toward governing bodies. Panelists also talked about Indigenous STS requiring an attention to Indigenous sovereignty and analytical approaches that get missed in non-Indigenous STS, but which can help shape radically different technoscientific interventions, say into public health and other areas. So on that same panel from yesterday, Wyatt Scheffelbein, who's a PhD student from the University of Alberta, his work lies at the intersections of Indigenous and CRIP technoscience. He explained that Indigenous STS helps bring our focus back to communities versus individual bodies as the primary analytic through which we can understand bodies themselves. So Scheffelbein is focused on structures that both condition our bodies and which are unevenly conditioned by and for certain bodies and not others. So by focusing on relations instead of objectification of bodies, can we shift societal structures? So go back to Marissa Duarte again, the Saturday plenary chair. She gave us a provocation to consider in an organizational meeting we had this week. She said that while some of Indigenous STS might be aimed at improving science, and I have talked about that, much of it is actually about dismantling colonial scientific structures. So to that end, Indigenous STS doesn't use Indigenous knowledge, for example, for the betterment of science, We do and we advocate doing science that is Indigenous-led for the betterment of Indigenous governance. So these ideas of dismantling dominant structures and expanding self-governance of those who resist that dominance, this is obviously not something limited to Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of conversation to be had among these panels and plenaries. And so with that, let me introduce the first panelist. So I also want to say, and I think I said in the chat, that you can enter your questions into the chat, and we will deal with some of them, or as many as we can, after the talks have been given. So the first speaker is Amy Hamrie, and Amy is Associate Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society and American Studies at Vanderbilt University, where they also direct the Critical Design Lab, a collaborative of disabled designers and researchers. And they are the author of Building Access, Universal Design, the Politics of Disability, and also the host of the Contra podcast on disability design justice, which sounds really interesting and cool. So, Amy, are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much, Kim. So my name is Amy Hamrie. I am a disabled Swana and diasporic Iranian scholar and designer. I'm speaking to you from the original homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Muskogee Creek Nations in what is now known as Nashville, Tennessee. I'm going to do a visual description of myself for accessibility. So I appear on your screen as an olive-skinned Iranian transmasculine person. I have short, dark, curly hair and rectangular glasses and some visible facial and neck hair. I'm wearing a blue shirt and I'm in a yellow room. And my slides are in a blue and white kind of format. Next slide, please. So my talk is going to be about the concept of interdependence as a political relational technology in disability studies. And before I get into that, I want to acknowledge that there are many interlocutors and also genealogies of the concept of interdependence that I won't necessarily be speaking to. But in addition to disability studies and disability movements, this concept is also significant in Black liberation philosophies. There are many examples from the Black Panther Party and also in the field of Black STS. This concept is also really significant, as Kim was just describing, to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous studies, movements, and Indigenous STS. And also I would mention feminist STS and movements as well. Next slide, please. So as the COVID-19 pandemic spread to the US in March 2020, members of the Disability Justice Collective, an activist collective in the Bay Area, gathered to do mutual aid with the surrounding community. And on this slide, I'm showing one photo of members of the collective. There are 5 members who are Black, Latinx, and Asian disabled people. And then there's also a second photo of someone pouring liquid into plastic bottles. This collective of disabled queer people of color and their accessible home served as the space for creating kits that included homemade hand sanitizer, masks, and gloves, technologies of sanitation that come from chronically ill disability cultures. They distributed these kits to the community members that they knew who were unhoused and didn't have access to soap and water. The late disability justice activist Stacy Milburn, shown in the upper right-hand corner of the left side photo, who died during the pandemic as a result of medical neglect and discrimination, and who was a central member of the collective and a leader in the disability justice movement, framed the kits as mutual aid and solidarity in the long tradition of disabled people using lived experience and knowledge of how to make and remake the world in order to build solidarities within and across communities. Here, they were recognizing that a large number of unhoused people are also disabled, but not often understood as prototypical disabled people in terms of disability rights discourses. Milburn called the knowledge undergirding both these technologies of sanitation and masking, which are technologies for keeping chronically ill people alive and preventing infections, and also the very construction of collective modes of solidarity and redistribution. She called this crip wisdom. The Disability Justice Culture Collective had actually started about a year earlier when the California power company PG&E threatened to shut off power to area homes to cut down on possible wildfires. Milburn and comrades led a mutual aid campaign to help disabled people on ventilators access energy. Part of the campaign included direct action in front of PG&E, and another included what we would call crypt technoscientific interventions, such as releasing information and protocols about how to hack air purifiers from box fans and HEPA filters during the fires. This was a crypt technology that later became necessary again during the pandemic. From there, the collective deepened its work and began to coordinate and distribute other forms of mutual aid, including financial aid. And the project had a focus on disabled people of color across multiple generations. As one member described it, the project focused on, quote, prioritizing the people that the government deems disposable, a reference to the explicit deprioritization of disabled people and unhoused people during medical triage for ventilators and other resources. Next slide, please. The DJCC highlights for me the ways that physical tools and technologies of interdependence, which is to say relational tools, how humans and non-humans interact for mutual survival and thriving, converge in response to ongoing crises resulting from the treatment of disabled people as disposable, what we could also think of as eugenic ideologies. By filling in the gaps of access left behind by what Jess Cowan calls settler ableism, and by the capitalist ableist apparatuses of federal accessibility guidelines premised on productivity and employment, the collective, the DJCC collective, highlights the political and relational valences of disability beyond medical models. Crip wisdom is its own technoscientific phenomenon, and there's much to learn from it in terms of how interdependence happens and what it sustains. The image on the screen is a screenshot from organizer Leah Lakshmi Piepshna Samarasinha, an article that she recently wrote called Why Disabled Mutual Aid is Different from Abled Mutual Aid, with the pull quote, "We are maybe not going to save the world, but we are going to save each other." And this distinction refers to the popularity of mutual aid networks and practices during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how even within those concepts, disabled people and crip ethics were not always central. Next slide, please. Typical forms of disability technoscience stigmatize dependence and aim to make a user independent, individual, and autonomous. The disabled philosopher of technology, Ashley Hsu, uses the term techno-ableism to describe the ableist assumptions about disability embedded in technoscientific milieus that attempt to liberate disabled people through tools and technologies. And as an example, I'm showing here an image from the early 20th century prosthetics manufacturer A.A. Marks, showing a before and after of a man putting on his two prosthetic legs. So this man is an amputee, he's wearing a suit. And in the after image, he assimilates and appears to be an able-bodied upright citizen. Next slide, please. By contrast, crip technoscience describes the politicized efforts of disabled people to resist normalcy through design, often by playing with relationality. The principles of crip technoscience that Kelly Fritsch and I offered in our 2019 manifesto are disabled people as knowers and makers, or crip wisdom, access as friction, interdependence as a political technology, and disability justice. Here on the slide, I'm showing a cover from the special issue of Catalyst on crip technoscience. It features a photo of a crip technoscience invention by John Farnworth, which is that the push handles of a manual wheelchair have been covered in punk aesthetic metal spikes, emphasizing the position of this wheelchair user who does not want to be pushed around by other people. This is a technology that refuses a specific relation, what Mia Mingus calls forced intimacy, a type of intimacy that disabled people are often subject to when our agency is denied. And it also contrasts with forms of access intimacy, also a term from Mingus that I will illustrate more later, which is a description of how interdependence transpires in the flow of creating access together in participatory ways. Next slide, please. One of the controversies within disability studies and culture and politics is the distinction between the mainstream, predominantly white disability rights movement and its focus on independence over dependence and its treatment of disability as an individual identity under the law, and the emerging disability justice framework. There are many disabled people of color who choose to disidentify with terms like disability or CRIP. And there are also movement leaders in the disability justice movement, which is led by disabled people of color and queer disabled people who embrace this term. And part of the reason for these differences has to do with vulnerability to state violence and debilitation and the risks associated with publicly claiming disability identity. In the context of disability justice, though, the emphasis is less on these individual aspects of identity and more on core values such as interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. And these features of interdependence are actually constitutive of what we would call disability culture, even when individual people don't identify as disabled. The kind of work appears the same, uses the same methods. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about disability as a political relational phenomenon. This is a term that comes from Alison Kafer, who argues that ways of thinking about disability that focus only on the body or on the stigmatizing effects of society can still depoliticize disability and draw attention away from the way that disabled people enact politics, often by engaging in world building. And she critiques Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto for presuming that disabled people have easy rather than ambivalent or political relationships to technologies. She writes, quote, "Cripping the cyborg, developing a non-ableist cyborg politics requires understanding disabled people as cyborgs not because of our bodies or use of technologies, but because of our political practices," end quote. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those practices are. Next slide, please. One more. Thank you. So CRIP political relations. Next slide. One example of interdependence as a political relational technology is the concept of design friction. On this slide, I'm showing a photo of a curb cut, which is a ramp that goes from a sidewalk to a street. It's made of concrete, and on the ramp, there's a pad of raised yellow dots made of plastic. Curb cuts were invented in the mid-20th century, and in Berkeley in the 1970s, there were all of these experiments with them. Wheelchair users needed them in order to get around town, but blind people pointed out that it was very dangerous to have a ramp that just goes into the street without announcing itself. And so they enacted a design process in which they actually embraced elements of friction rather than assimilation, hiding the ramp. They embraced friction as a way of announcing the place of disability in the built environment and to have a functional use. So the tactile paving, the yellow stuff, lets someone know underfoot that the street is coming. And it's also symbolic of refusing to assimilate disability into the built environment because it makes the presence of access known. It leaves traces of this kind of interactive, interdependent, cross-disability history. Next slide. Another type of political relation is the network and its affordances. This is theorized in many ways in disability studies, Black disabled feminist hashtag activism, which is a term that comes from Moya Bailey and also Melissa Thompson is an example of, for example, using Twitter and social networks to advance politics. There are transnational networks of design prototyping in which disabled people share their blueprints and hacks. There's a really interesting book by Helene Millet about Stephen Hawking, in which she shows that his knowledge production and the way that it's attributed to a singular genius is actually a result of the broader networks of assistance and technologies upon which he draws. I also find very compelling the concept of microactivist affordances from Arceli Dokumachi, which draws on performance theory to describe the kind of mundane acts of world building that in which disabled people and their families and other people engage as forms of activism just in the everyday, changing the environment. The disabled activist Lori Erickson did a really interesting thing where she created a network of attendants because care was not provided by the state or health insurance. And this is a mutual aid network of friends and close relations. And in the context of creating the network, there's also a constant questioning of the military industrial or the medical industrial complex. So that's the sort of political relational component. And then finally is the concept of collective access, which is very popular in disability justice. This emerged from a conference in Detroit, the Allied Media Conference, that was not providing access. And so disabled people created a mutual aid network in which they coordinated access internally. And the philosophies that came out of this process also then informed the Disability Justice Culture Club and had some of the same membership. Next slide, please. So my final example is going to be about political relational protocols. In design, protocols are replicable, communal, and emergent forms of making. And in disability culture, design protocols serve as ways to share knowledge with openness toward its non-innocence and the potential need for reinvention. And this also, of course, recalls Murphy's notion of protocol feminism. An example of access as a political relational phenomenon is a project that we do in the Critical Design Lab called the Remote Access Dance Party. This is hosted quarterly. We started it at the beginning of the pandemic to showcase, use, and further iterate the many technologies of interdependence that already exist within disability culture, the many processes of access making as mutual aid. And so in order to facilitate this, we created a document, a participation guide, which is a protocol that other people can also share and replicate and have parties like this one, which I'll describe more in a second. But it's really a protocol for relating across long distances during social distancing and designing a kind of participatory convivial cultures. Next slide, please. So on the screen shows this is a screenshot of a Zoom screen. There are, I think, 25 boxes. People are holding up their hands as if to be touching each other as part of a ritual of virtual connection. We can see into their homes, beds, living rooms. Some of the screens are like bright pink, others are dark. And the text says, magic, or this is the captioning text says, magic is feeling proximity to others even when we aren't close at all. This party is a dance party that we designed based on disability culture protocols for sharing space virtually, built on the earlier work of chronically ill, neurodivergent, blind, and deaf people. And the party is interactive, even though it's socially distanced, and every part of access in the party, so the ASL interpreter, transcription, live image and audio descriptions, sharing disability art, music descriptions, all of this is collectively carried out by the participants and a team of people that we call access doulas, which is a term that comes from Kevin Gotkin. And so the things that would ordinarily just be kind of individual modes of access are enacted collectively as the social activity of the party. Next slide, please. And so one recent iteration of this was that Kevin Gotkin and Yo-Yo Lin, two artists, built a three-dimensional platform called the Glitch Realm, in which people could access the party in an interactive way. And so the way that it worked is that there was the Zoom screen at the front with the ASL interpreter and the DJ, and there was this kind of virtual dance floor with a ball hanging from the ceiling, and people moved around as avatars within it. And the closer you got to someone, the more you could hear them. And there were also access doulas in there kind of guiding people around. And so people would basically work together to navigate this kind of fantastical virtual space that just kind of looked like limitless space with these kind of green swirls and stuff around it, and have conversations and listen to music. So this is an example of interdependence as a political relational technology, because participation in the party relies on everyone showing up for each other and creating access in a mutual and unfolding process. And through this process, new relationships are forged that make further relating possible. And there's actually a collective of party organizers that grew out of this. One way to make sense of political relational technologies is to think about distinctions between the STS study of the politics of technology and CRIP cultural conceptions of technologized political relations, such as interdependence. The relations themselves are the technology, and they emerge from crip wisdom and histories. What is at stake in this distinction is precisely these differences between disability rights and justice, and the forms of access that are understood as politicized and mutual. Interdependence as a political relational technology acknowledges the role of material technologies, such as the ones shown here, in shaping and enabling or disabling, but also draws attention to the quality and practices of relationships and how that world materializes and toward what ends. Thank you.
Preview in front of all my buttons. So, okay, so thank you, Amy. Our second speaker is Dr. Shay-Akil McLean, and he's an independent scholar, and his talk is entitled Science That Unsettles: Positive Actions and Good Ecological Relations. And before I give his bio, for those of you that might have joined late, you're welcome to put questions in the chat, and we may get to some of those towards the end of the plenary. So Shay-Akil McLean is a social and natural scientist who studies evolutionary genetics, theoretical population genetics, race and racism, Du Boisian historical sociology, STS, philosophies of science, and biology. His work seeks to understand how social, political, and economic inequalities influence health and contribute to the perpetuation of health inequalities. By analyzing human genetic data, human osteological remains, medical and dental records, and historical demographic methods, he aims to better understand how the relationships that colonized and racialized peoples have to various forms of structural domination, and how that dictates who gets sick, when they get sick, where, why, and how. A very pertinent topic right now, but always. Are you ready, Shay-Akil?
Greetings, everybody, and good afternoon. Specifically, I am located currently in Buffalo, New York, specifically Seneca territory. I'm not even going to make the mistake of butchering how to pronounce it, because I know for a fact that I can spell it, but for some odd reason can't pronounce it. You can go to the next slide. I want to make sure that as I acknowledge my place or in the land in and of itself, most importantly, I also make this specific note that this is not merely an acknowledgement, because in most cases, especially in scientific and academic spaces, the acknowledgement of land is often merely a mentioning rather than an actual respectful acknowledgement. And also, I want to make sure that I acknowledge that that land very much still does belong to itself, and as well as is in relation to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, specifically in this place, Seneca, the Seneca Nation. And as a Pan-Africanist and Nkrumah Reyes, I stand in solidarity with all indigenous peoples against European settler capitalist mass extinction. Okay, so next slide. So what I'm trying to kind of play around with regards to these questions is making sense of what are we even trying to talk about when we have a conversation about positive action as well as good relations, but specifically in an ecological context. So overall, in that sense, then also what are ecological perspectives bringing to our understanding of good relations and what are good ecological relations, and then understanding the kinds of ideologies that are required to assist us in practicing positive action towards the goal of achieving decolonization. And I have a third question that is connected to the other two, but in a larger sense, I just have there because I know I'm not going to completely have the answers, but this is something I constantly think about. Is it even possible to unsettle science? And I ask that question with regards to possibility because I know for a fact, as a scientist who is trained in the fields of sociology, biological anthropology, as well as ecology, evolution, and conservation biology, both anthropology and sociology are grounded on a series of different premises that are antithetical to decolonization. Anthropology, in my personal opinion, as well as in my scholarly opinion, just doesn't need to exist. It can just go away. I'm fine with that. We can do something else. So many other possibilities there, isn't that? So there is some science that doesn't need saving. It's people I'm interested in saving, not disciplines. I don't care. I'm interested in saving the environments we live in, the other forms of life. So with that understanding, I'm really trying to make sure I think about how we go about actually unsettling science. We're saying it as a thing and in a concept, but what does that look like in practice, right? Moving from theory to practice, and also having a sense of understanding that there are some things that will be abandoned, and that's fine. And I'm completely fine with that. Okay, so next slide. So one of the things that I always try to start conversations with, and I do this often with students as well, is understanding that everything is a thing with a history and set of relations. And to make sense of that, I go to Bertel Oman's work in his book, Dialectical Investigations, where he states that understanding anything in our everyday requires that we know something about how it arose and developed and how it fits into the larger context or system of which it is. And the small statement on the left-hand side of the slide, bottom left-hand side of the slide reads, "It is important to note that when we speak of structures, systems, and institutions, we are still talking about people, collectively organized in a way that is based on a particular set of rules and relations. And to speak of structures, systems, and institutions then is to speak of coordinated collective human." And I'm saying that in the sense to where when we have larger theoretical discussions about what a structure is, structures are the culmination of collective human actions. As a consequence of us going through what we see as small components of our everyday lives, they have major consequences at a series of different scales that we often do not readily recognize or sense. And it's important for us to make sure we're aware of this. Next slide. So one of the things that I think is important for us to do is definitions. Make sure we have definitions. So first, what is ecology and what is human ecology? And you'll see on the right-hand side, there's an image of me as a cartoon character for my website, Decolonize All the Things. And left-hand side, I have some excerpts really trying to get at what the science of ecology itself and the study of the environment has to say about what these terms are with respect to ecology and human ecology. So according to William Catton, ecology is understood as the study of ecosystems, or more broadly, ecologists study the interactions of differentiated organisms between these differentiated organisms and the non-living components of their environment. So for William Catton, human ecology is seen as an extension of ecological concepts into the study of human affairs. And if you look below that, I have a quote from evolutionary biologists Richard Lewontin and Richard Levins to kind of have in a context to look at the Catton definition in a comparative sense. If you think about Catton's definition, it only makes sense if you assume that humans are not part of the environment, which doesn't make any sense at all. So there's the assumption that ecological concepts are being extended into the study of human affairs. Human affairs have always been the part of ecology. The extension is just based on the assumption that they were originally separate and distinct, which is not the case. Looking at the Lewontin and Levin's quote helps us get a little bit context for that, where it states that human ecology is not the relation of our species in general with the rest of nature, but rather the relations of different societies and the classes, genders, ages, grades, and ethnicities maintained by these social structures. And in a more broad and realistic sense, there is really no way to just see human ecology as simply just the relation of our species with the rest of nature, because in a lot of different senses as well, humans have to be understood as part of nature, not in antagonism with it necessarily. Next slide. So one of the things that I tried to make sense of when trying to answer the questions, the guiding questions, was, okay, so if I'm talking about relations and good relations, and we have a sense of an understanding of what ecology is with regards to the interactions between different forms of life. Okay, what are relationships then? What are relationships referring to? What kind of interactions are we dealing with, and what is the definition of an interaction, right? And this is all within the context of power. So, of course, relationships are ultimately just how two or more things or concepts or objects or people are connected, and also then how they behave towards each other. So it's important to understand the relationship as a concept in and of itself, and relation necessitates interaction. And one of the things that I think is important to understand about relationships is the role of power. So one of the things that I try to get people to understand a little bit more about power is that we're dealing with it on a series of different scales. Power operates internalized, in an internalized sense, where it's intrapersonal. You internalize your own sense and understanding of interactions with the outside world, quote unquote. Power operates interpersonally, so between individuals and groups. Institutionally, in a sense to where we have collective organizations that are operating in a particular set of connections to one another, and then systematically or across institutions themselves in a broader sense. And with regards to how power operates with respect to relationships, we have to think about how power is utilized. If my action that I take is to control my own behavior in my own state, then that's a form of power too. But if I engage in an interaction where my interest is to control and influence the will of other individuals against their own interests, then that is referred to as power over. And I want you all to try to just keep these concepts in mind as we review some of the larger components of the study of ecology and with regards to racism and settler colonialism. Next slide. On the left-hand side, you see an image that has a background of a nebula, and on it you see the quote from Chief Seattle: "Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves." And in this same sense, one of the things that I talked about with with regards to my dissertation research is the fact that what you do to land and what you do to people cannot be separated. What you do to the land, you do to the people. You do to the people, you do to the land. These things are not as distinct as we would like to believe they are. And most importantly, how humans treat one another is an ecological system in and of itself. And we are each other's environment, because the individual is always already communal. An individual human being necessitates the existence of at least two more. And that just keeps climbing up in scale because the existence of the other two necessitates an existence of another two before that. In that sense, it's not just that we are solely communal because we are social beings, but also we're communal as biological phenomena. These things cannot be separated. When humans are born, we're just adorable and we cry and we poop all over everything and pee. That's pretty much it. A lot of other than human animals and beings, for instance, if you think about a deer, when a fawn is born, it has to be able to run within the next 2 to 3 hours after it's born, or else it could potentially be in danger of being eaten. Humans take way longer than 2 to 3 hours to learn to walk. For example, we rely on one another. It's a fact of life. It is not a shortcoming, it's a fact of life. And with taking that understanding forward, next slide, one of the things I want us to start thinking about is what we're actually told about how the world works, specifically with regards to human relations, which brings us to a conversation about racism in ecology. Joe Koval wrote this piece, and it was published in the journal Socialism and Democracy in 2010, where one of the things that he states is that excluding humans as natural creatures in our own ecological relations means you're ignoring those relations that humans have set up and impose on other creatures, and relations that include both the degradation of nature and the overcoming of that degradation. And within that larger sense, in an ecological perspective, we can understand racism as a form of splitting. Splitting in ecosystemic terms is manifest as a failure of recognition. We can say that the ecological crisis produces and is produced by a splitting between humanity and the rest of nature, such that we do not recognize ourselves as part of nature, nor nature as part of ourselves. That is, we lose both naturalism and humanism. So in this sense or terms that Koval is pointing to, we can understand racism as a system of splitting into races. But one of the things I've recognized is that commonly in Euro-Western societies, racism and understanding it as a splitting of races is generally only understood in the terms of splitting humans into races. But racialization is a system that extends way and far beyond humans. And one of the core prerequisites for splitting into races is Euro-colonial concepts like the Great Chain of Being. So splitting into races was only possible because humans were deciding that they were so separate or different and superior to all other forms of life that were not human. Next slide. So with taking this into consideration with regards to how splitting works, how we can degrade ecological systems based on how we treat one another and understand our relationships to one another. One of the things that I wanted to have a greater understanding of was relations and relationality, which brought me to Tynan's work. This article published this year, What is Relationality? Indigenous Knowledges, Practices, and Responsibilities with Kin. Relationality is understood as being in good relation, and most importantly, as not a new metaphor, is what Tynan tries to get at in the very beginning of their work. So relationality is not a new metaphor to be reaped for academic gain, but a practice bound with responsibilities with kin and country. Cree scholar Sean Wilson emphasizes that an indigenous reality is relationships. Relationships are reality, and reality is relationships. As indigenous people, we are our relationships with other people. So in this sense as well, when we say that the relationality is a practice bound with responsibilities with kin and country, country is a common form or reference to Aboriginal land, and that how all land is Aboriginal land. So it's a term that is used by many Aboriginal groups in Australia to delineate understandings from the English word land. So in saying country, you're also referring to not just the land, but all the other forms of life that are connected to it. So as a foundation, relationality is how the world is known and how we as peoples, country, entities, stories, and more than human kin know ourselves and our responsibilities to one another. And this is premised on the truth that all living things, all things, period, exist in relatedness, which is just a basic fact. So within that perspective, we're talking about a larger system and the interactions. So we're talking about treatment. And that's something important for us to take into consideration with regards to how we go about establishing what we see as appropriate or ethical scientific practice. Next slide. So one of the things that, the previous one. Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that I engaged with was thinking about the connection between ecological concepts as well as understanding what good relations are. And these things are intertwined. They're inseparable. So I have on the left-hand side 2 points. One, that good ecological relations are what kind of qualities they have. They will have qualities of being non-coercive, mutually respectful, reciprocal, consensual, reparative, and caring. And the second point is that good ecological relations are the foundations of ethics. In the sense, so ethics defined by philosopher Anthony Weston as meaning taking care of the basic needs and legitimate expectations of others as well as our own and ourselves. And if you look on the right-hand side, there are 2 quotes, one from Wildcat, the other from Tynan, where they make points about understanding ecological relations, but also the Wildcat quote is about imagining in a number of different ways. So can you imagine a world where nature is understood as full of relatives and not resources? Where inalienable rights are balanced with inalienable responsibilities, and where wealth itself is measured not by resource ownership and control, but by the number of good relationships we maintain in the complex and diverse life systems of this blue-green planet? I can. Tynan states that Mary Graham describes what Wildcat was saying as a relationist ethos, where the 2 most important kinds of relationships in life are, firstly, those between land and people, and secondly, those amongst people themselves. The second being always contingent upon the first. The relationship between land and humans is held together by an intricate web of relatedness that envelopes all entities. Next slide. One of the things I think is important to take into consideration is the idea that things are separated, that people are, or living things are not connected to one another, are directly connected to, of course, that general concept of splitting and racialization, and the idea of being separate from nature itself, which is directly connected to Euro-colonial concepts of civilization, right? Which has led us to a planet that is currently on fire and disease-ridden. Instead of thinking about things in a general concept as simply rights, the language in relationality is moved to responsibilities. And responsibilities are collective, right? And in that sense, one of the things that came to mind was thinking about the relationships between good ecological relations, that general concepts, and that of freedom that Simone de Beauvoir referred to in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. And the quote reads, "We have we have to respect freedom only when it is intended for freedom, not when it strays, flees itself, and resigns itself. A freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied. And it is not true that the recognition of the freedom of others limits my own freedom. To be free is not to have the power to do anything you like. It is to be able to surpass the given toward an open future. The existence of others as a freedom defines my situation and is even the condition of my own freedom. I am not oppressed if I am thrown into prison, but I am oppressed if I am thrown into prison, but not if I'm kept from throwing my neighbor into prison. So, relational concepts and understanding larger philosophical questions of freedom versus that of oppression, democracy, the general Western orientation that we have towards these things, which is really nested in the concept of inalienable rights. The language of relationality points us to that of responsibility, collective responsibilities. And I think that that is way more realistic, as well as beneficial in the sense of moving forward with regards to how do we go about unsettling the ways we do relate with one another and the ways we go about practicing scientific research and scholarship. Next slide. So moving from a conversation about relationality to positive action would necessitate that we then start thinking about, okay, what does do these things look like in practice, right? And positive action is referring to a set of ideologies with regards to the colonial situation itself. The concept and the term was created originally by Kwame Nkrumah in his book Consciencism, which he wrote in 1964. It's a text on the general philosophy of decolonization. And he states that in a colonial situation, positive action and negative action can be discerned. Positive action will represent the sum of those forces seeking social justice in terms of the destruction of oligarchic exploitation and oppression. Negative action will correspondingly represent the sum of those forces tending to prolong colonial subjugation and exploitation. Positive action is revolutionary and negative action is reactionary. And in that sense, Nkrumah also states that to achieve true liberation, positive action must begin with an objective analysis of the situation which it seeks to change. So it's important that we consider what positive actions can be taken to meet the needs of communities that are most impacted by racism, for instance, most impacted those by colonialism. And it's important for us to also note that our ideas, if they are not properly executed or practiced, they don't occur, then they practically do not exist. So I say this in the sense to where what I'm really thinking about is the massive forces of neoliberalism, of white neoliberalism that are present in academia, especially in settler America. There are tons of conversations about anti-racism and whatever else makes white people feel good about themselves. But there is very little, if any, action that is taken that challenges the colonial situation. That rarely, if ever, happens. And there needs to be a particular sense and framework for understanding whether or not settler colonialism is being challenged in your work. There is always an answer. And the reality is we have to be confrontational about it, because colonialism is not going to go away if you write a nice letter to it. It requires confrontation. And the idea that it requires confrontation is not my idea. That's Frantz Fanon. You can find that in Wretched of the Earth, I think on the fourth page. But next slide. So in that sense, science that unsettles is a particular type of scientific work that is much like truth. It's on the side of the oppressed. If your work and your scholarship is causing harm to colonized peoples, it's not unsettling anything. It's just colonialism. It's just regular colonialism. And I make this point specifically with Nkrumah in mind, where he states that the people are the backbone of positive action. So this is about confronting the colonial situation. The people are the backbone of positive action. Most importantly, the colonized people are the backbone of positive action. It is by the people's effort that colonialism is rooted. It is by the sweat of the people's brow that nations are built. It is the people who suffer the depredations and indignities of colonialism, and the people must not be insulted by dangerous flirtations with neocolonialism. So in that sense, that means that, once again, reflective questions. What type of scientific scholarship do you want to practice? For whom? Who is it for? To what end and at whose expense? And also actively thinking about what kind of world your scientific scholarship makes. What kind of world are you producing? Next slide. In making sense of what positive action is, one of the things that Nkrumah talks about was the importance of understanding that positive action requires an ideology that can bring about massive organization. And one of the things that I did was go to the work of Susan Strega and the book Researchers' Resistance to kind of pull some of that out in a sense to where the language can become a little bit easier for us to make sense of in a practical kind of way. So an ideology is a worldview that informs those within a society of what is possible or impossible, right? An ontology, in comparison, is a theory about what the world is like in a descriptive sense. So all that the world is and consists of, and that's descriptive, and what it ought to be is in prescriptive. So for example, when we say that we are interested in the creation of a new kind of society, like in regards to what Fanon referred to in Wretched of the Earth and defining colonial decolonization, that is a prescriptive ontology. We are talking about what the world ought to be. An epistemology is understood as a philosophy of what counts as knowledge, what counts as truth, and is a strategy as well by which beliefs themselves are justified. And epistemologies, as theories of knowledge, answer questions about who can know, what kind of tests that information and beliefs have to pass to be considered true knowledge, and also what kinds of things can potentially or possibly be known. Next slide. And the importance and significance of ideology, which is going to help us achieve the overall goal of applying positive action. The ideology that's about, like, what do we understand about our situation, and taking that to move forward to take practical actions of challenging the colonial situation, which means we challenge colonial relations. And that means we also, in challenging colonial relations, we take up the responsibilities that we have to one another, to the land, and to other than human kin. So in this slide, one of the things I was thinking
I don't know
about
if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can
Sorry,
hear you.
we're at 31 minutes, so I
Okay,
don't know if
I'm
you're
good.
getting close to
This is the
being
last
finished.
one.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
So ultimately, the whole point of moving from relationality to positive action is about theory meeting practice. So science that unsettles always necessitates the practice of positive action, which requires an intellectual revolution in order for a social revolution to be achieved. The intellectual revolution is understood by Nkrumah as a revolution in which our thinking and philosophy are directed towards the redemption of our society, which requires two aims. First, the restitution of the egalitarianism of human society, and second, the logistic mobilization of all of our resources towards the attainment of that restitution. And in that sense, then we have a requirement and a responsibility to not depoliticize any of our work, because to claim to depoliticize it in the first place is just to side with colonialism. So the political principles are at the core of every single practice, scientific practice that we take, and it cannot be avoided, much like decolonization.
I will introduce our third speaker. That is Oahikea Male, who is a Kanaka Maoli scholar, activist, and practitioner for Maunawili, Oahu. He's an assistant professor of Indigenous politics in the Department of Political Science and affiliate faculty with the Center of Indigenous Studies and the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Toronto. And his talk is on anti-colonialism in space. We should have had the Star Wars theme for that one. Maybe that's old and dated. I'm not a sci-fi person. Take it away.
Loha mai kākou, o Oahikea Maile wau, he kanaka Hawaii au, ka he pulapeka au I ke Kulanui o University of Toronto, mai takaranto mai I ka District 1 Spoon, ona po'e o iwi o Abe, Haudenosaunee, Mississauga, Ame, Huron-Wendat. Aloha everybody, I am Oahikea Maile. I am a Kanaka Maoli assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Political Science. I'm so grateful to be engaging with my colleagues in this plenary today on Unsettling Science. I am a relatively masculine presenting person with light brown skin. I don't identify as a man, but some might perceive my hairstyle to be a man bun. It's actually a pu, which is a traditional Kanaka Maoli hairstyle. And I'm in my office and sitting in front of my bookshelves with a bunch of books behind me. With that said, I am going to get started. Human settlement elsewhere in the universe isn't a new desire, but the recent corporate space flights launched by some of the richest men on our planet have reignited this lust and propelled a discursive explosion about space colonization. Privately funded aerospace manufacturers and spaceflight companies are now transporting individuals into the mesospheric and thermospheric layers of the atmosphere, as well as around the world, the Earth, on orbital trips. Billed for tourism instead of terraforming, these corporations have pioneered a market for wealthy elite to book and purchase commercial space flights. The first time ever for civilians, with a price point starting at $250,000 for a suborbital tour, and an estimated $55 million for an orbital one. With advanced technology and massive capital on display in this private industry and consumer market, the demand for space exploration and desire for space colonization have grown astronomically. But there's another side to the coin. While some astronomers, astrophysicists, and cosmologists may criticize the burgeoning commercial industry for space exploration and its various forms of colonialism, these scientists can overlook how their own desire for technoscientific infrastructure and instrumentation to explore space is steeped in colonial relations of power and indeed settler colonialism on Earth. In enterprise and research for space exploration, the conquest of new high frontiers requires the colonization of old earthly ones. My talk this afternoon is organized into three primary parts. First, I discuss the recent triad of flights launched by three spaceflight corporations and their hyper-wealthy white male founders to identify how space tourism is related to space colonization. Second, I reconstruct some of the dominant criticisms of space exploration's private industry to highlight the ways that astronomers in particular articulate ideas about anti-colonialism in space. There are certainly crucial conversations and debates taking place about colonialism and anti-colonialism in space, but I contend that they tend to erase colonialism and obscure anti-colonialism on Earth. Third and finally, I turn to a case study, the Kanaka Maoli movement, the indigenous movement to protect our sacred mountain Mauna Kea in Hawaii from the proposed construction of the 30-meter telescope observatory. And I argue that scientific desire for this cutting edge infrastructure and instrumentation that is indeed to explore outer space and for space colonization, in particular, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and the search to discover Earth analog planets beyond our solar system, all hinges upon colonial dispossession, dehumanization, and elimination of Indigenous people on our planet. To conclude, I want to stew on some of the ways that the Kanaka Maoli movement to protect Mauna Kea and prevent construction of the 30-meter telescope does indeed critically unsettle what I call techno-scientific conquest. Slide, please. Space tourism in the present is setting the stage for space colonization. On July 11, 2021, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic fired its ship Unity with 2 pilots and 4 crew members to an altitude of approximately 86 kilometers on a suborbital flight to the edge of space, lasting about 2.5 hours. This is a photograph of their crew. From left to right, pilot Dave McKay, Colin Bennett, lead operations engineer, Beth Moses, chief astronaut instructor, Richard Branson, Sirisha Bandla, vice president of government affairs and research operations, and pilot Michael Masucci. Although Branson exclaimed that the trip was magical, last month the US Federal Aviation Administration opened an investigation into a trajectory deviation and mishap during their ascent. This Monday, however, the FAA lifted its grounding of Virgin Galactic, and the company is planning its first commercial research flight, Unity 23, later this month. Virgin Galactic last reported in August that 600 people have reserved seats on future space flights, including American actor Tom Hanks and Canada's own pop star Justin Bieber. They anticipate offering 400 flights per year. Unfortunately, if you're a wealthy white man like them, with $250,000 to spare for a flight to space, you're out of luck because the company has paused sales. Next slide, please. Only 10 days later, after Branson's Unity 22 flight, Jeff Bezos launched his autonomously piloted Blue Origin's rocket ship named New Shepard for a 10-minute flight to an altitude of 106 kilometers. Here's a photograph of New Shepard's 4-person crew at a press conference after their successful flight. From left to right, Oliver Damon, Mark Bezos, Jeff Bezos, and Wally Funk. And I love this photograph, especially because of the cowboy hat that Jeff Bezos just had to put on after their successful space cowboy adventures. Claiming it was the best day ever, Bezos, Amazon founder and former CEO, was criticized for participating in the billionaire space race in a pandemic period of severe economic downturn and compounding socioeconomic inequality globally. His response was that revenue from Blue Origin space tourism could increase wages for workers, bolster the economy, and be used to fight climate change. In one interview, Bezos insisted, quote, "We need to take all heavy industry, all polluting industry, and move it into space and keep Earth this beautiful gem of a planet," end quote. To put this in perspective, in 2020, Amazon's pandemic-fueled growth resulted in a record $386 billion in revenue, boosting Bezos' wealth by $48 billion. Meanwhile, Amazon's carbon dioxide emissions rose 19% from 51.17 to 60.64 million metric tons. Bezos' theory is that Blue Origin and space tourism in general can accelerate access to space and thus manufacture technology and infrastructure to save Earth from anthropogenic by finding and creating a new home for humans in space. In 2019, he proposed developing millions of space colonies that could house trillions of people, whom could be sustained by continuous sunshine and resources extracted from the moon and asteroids. The High Frontier thesis, drawing on physicist Gerard O'Neill's ideas from his book in 1977, has fueled Blue Origin to build a lunar lander capable of delivering cargo and astronauts to the moon by 2024. In this vision, billionaire technocrats may end up governing humans in massive cylindrical space colonies, which could effectively turn into labor camps, but at least the Earth and humans, in Bezos' theory, might survive beyond the code red of 2050. Next slide, please. Just 1 month ago, SpaceX launched the first fully commercial spaceflight called Inspiration 4 to orbit the Earth without professional astronauts. The flight, according to space historian John Logsdon, quote, marks a transition in human spaceflight from public to private, end quote. An autonomously piloted spacecraft owned and operated by Tesla CEO Elon Musk, the project was funded by billionaire entrepreneur Jared Isaacman, who paid an estimated $55 million for his own seat. This is a photo of the 4-person civilian crew. From left to right is Jared Isaacman, Cyan Proctor, Haley Arsenault, and Chris Sembrowski. SpaceX's Inspiration 4 is currently, and I mean currently, circling the Earth in orbit 100 miles higher than the International Space Station and farther from any other planets that astronauts have traveled to in space. Elon Musk views the Inspiration 4 mission to be a path-breaking journey equivalent to crossing the Atlantic to explore the New World. But instead of European conquest of the Americas, his eyes are on Mars. The initial name of SpaceX commercial spacecraft was the Mars Colonial Transporter, and the company is already accepting sales inquiries for this mission. Mars and beyond, the road to making humanity multi-planetary. Distinct from Bezos' theory, Musk, whose net worth is $210 billion compared to Bezos's $186 billion, believes that colonizing Mars is necessary to have life insurance for human life if there's something terrible that happens on Earth, either made by humans. If you can't afford the insurance to settle Mars, SpaceX is currently selling Occupy Mars t-shirts, which Musk is frequently seen wearing. Next slide, please. The frontiersmen of the universe are no longer Hollywood's Clint Eastwood, Tommy Lee Jones, and Donald Sutherland. Today's space cowboys are Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson, depicted here from left to right. So what are scientists, astronomers, astrophysicists, and cosmologists saying about the private industry for space exploration? Next slide, please. This is an image from NASA that depicts the space colony that O'Neill thought up. Some suggest that it's colonial and offer criticisms focused on anti-colonialism in space. On one hand, astronomers contend that space exploration for human settlement reproduces the colonial rhetoric, policy, and violence against Indigenous peoples on Earth. In a recent New Yorker article titled, "Is Mars Ours?" Black cosmologist Shonda Prescott Weinstein noted, quote, "Figuring out how to settler colonize the United States didn't help us live in a more ethical global community," end quote. In the same article, Mi'kmaq astronomer Hilding Nielsen said, quote, "What I see are organizations that view Mars in the same way that colonizers, pioneers, and settlers viewed the early West, that it was terra nullius, a land of opportunity for them, and that land was free to make and take," end quote. The argument here is not simply that space colonization excludes those with capital and minoritized communities. It's an argument that desires for human settlement beyond Earth continue to depend upon the ongoing colonization of and nations, our territories, and notably our sacred sites on this planet. While I consider this a more robust analysis, on the other hand, there are liberal opinions that posit the private sector is colonizing the skies in its pursuit for conquest in space. Next slide, please. This is a political cartoon of former American astronaut John Glenn gazing at space junk during an interview stating, quote, 50 years ago when I went to space, there was actually space, end quote. In her 2020 article, SpaceX's Starlink satellites are about to ruin stargazing for everyone, astronomy professor Samantha Lawler criticizes SpaceX's Starlink mega constellation that promises to provide global internet access. Lawler's contention is fourfold. First, stars are obscured by mega constellations of satellites. Second, professional astronomy and amateur astrophotography will be adversely affected by light pollution from these satellites. Third, mega constellations like Starlink increasingly abandon satellite debris, and there is little regulation and enforcement to govern cleanup of the space junk. Fourth, corporate space explorers like SpaceX and Blue Origins are disconnecting the human species, and in her particular article, this includes native peoples, from our relationship to the cosmos. Here on Earth, however, Enlightenment sciences like astronomy have ordered some humans, like native peoples, inferior to others, like white Euro-American settlers, in the name of humanity. The concern over colonialism in space, claimed as a universal issue for all humanity by astronomers, at best abstracts and at worst erases the ongoing colonization of indigenous peoples, lands, and sacred places, so that technoscience might be developed for astronomy research. After all consultations and interviews I've done about decolonizing science, indigenizing astronomy, and anti-colonialism in space, the basic recommendation I offer is this work is hollow and insincere without land back for indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. To conclude, I want to turn to the proposed development of the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii and Kanaka Maoli resistance to its construction on Mauna Kea. This is a photograph I took on Mauna Kea in the morning on July 16th, 2019. Estimated to be 18 stories tall and cost $2.4 billion. Next slide, please. TMT is a crucial case study to consider how scientific knowledge production in astronomy fields, in particular for exoplanet research, which is the study of planets outside of our solar system, is premised upon and perpetuates settler colonialism. The colonial dispossession, dehumanization, and elimination of indigenous peoples on Earth. This is another photograph of mine taken of an original model for TMT that is actually housed at the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Toronto. An institutional member of the Association of Canadian Universities for Research in Astronomy that is a founding of the TMT Corporation. This model is less than a block away from where I'm sitting right now. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, Indigenous opposition to TMT in Hawaii offers important lessons globally for what it means to unsettle science. Here is a photo I took in the early days of the 2019 blockade against TMT construction at the base of Mauna Kea. There are thousands here, and I believe it was a Saturday or a Sunday, that descended to the entrance of Mauna Kea Access Road where the blockade had erected, and across the street there was a refuge, Pu'uhonua, tucked into the hillside of Pu'uhuluhulu, which is a small hill across the highway, Daniel K. Inouye Highway. Insofar as decolonization is not a metaphor, according to Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's now foundational article, so too, unsettling science not metaphorical. And you can see that here. In Hawaii, unsettling science means preventing astronomy industry development in our islands, and therein disrupting and interrupting techno-scientific conquest in outer space. For 2 decades, Kanaka Maoli protectors of Mauna Kea, identifying as Kia'i, the guardians of the mountain, have averted TMT construction on the ground and in court. By reoccupying our national lands and reasserting sovereign jurisdiction over them, Kanaka Maoli are attempting to maintain relations of inseparability, reciprocity, and responsibility to care for the mountain, an animate, existent, and ancestral relative. Lawsuits have disturbed the pace to break ground quickly, whereas direct action blockades like you see here have disturbed the pace, have interrupted the construction at Mauna Kea's northern plateau. It's an unsettling of science that, as Kanaka Maoli historian Maile Arvin theorized, regenerates our indigenous ecological ways of being through a refusal of settler colonial capitalism. In particular, explained in new research of mine, it is an unsettling not just of hegemonic forms of settler science, but an unsettling specifically of techno-scientific desires to discover non-human life and planets beyond our solar system that are habitable for human life. TMT is praised as a techno-scientific project promising to revolutionize the study of exoplanets in the search for aliens and planets that humans could one day colonize and settle. Scientific desires for space exploration are not so different than corporate ones after all. Some want to occupy Mars, some want to occupy Mauna Kea. Nevertheless, the regenerative refusal by Kanaka Maoli in resistance to TMT demonstrates how indigenous movements to protect land, water, sacred sites, from Mauna Kea to Standing Rock and Wet'suwet'en, and elsewhere, offer invaluable lessons about anti-colonialism here on Earth, about extractivism and anti-capitalism, and about how to live together in balance and good ways on a planet devastated by the forces of capitalism and colonialism, but not yet destroyed. Mahalo. Thanks.
Thank you. We have 13 minutes left in the plenary, and I see there is I'm trying to figure this out here. I no longer have a hand raised, and I don't see. There was one question early on that wasn't articulated, but it was Elizabeth Simpson had a question about I think it was human-machine relations, but the question's not there. I don't know if you still want to ask that, Elizabeth, if you're still here. And then if there are any other questions they can go into the chat, or if the panelists want to make comments on each other's or ask questions of each other until I see something in chat. I have no questions. I mean, I kind of do, but I want to throw the floor to you panelists to talk to each other a bit if you'd like. Okay, I can ask a question. I have to find okay, it was a tech glitch. All right, Elizabeth says no. So, Amy, I wanted you to say more, but I was also trying to watch all the, logistics, and so maybe you got into this, but I was really interested in the concept of forced intimacy. I hadn't thought about, obviously until you said that, and then I was just horrified, because I know I've seen, so I don't know if there's and you talked also about access intimacy, and I think, so I was interested in hearing you say a little bit more about that, and I'm actually not quite sure what access intimacy is, and it could be you addressed it, but I was just dealing with logistics.
Yeah, thank you for that. So both of these terms come from the disability justice activist Mia Mingus, and she describes forced intimacy as the types of relationships that disabled people are often forced to have, for example, with caretakers, or with the state in terms of negotiating access to resources, or in the example of the person who had the spikes on their wheelchair to avoid being pushed. I think a common experience for some wheelchair users is that people involuntarily touch and engage with those technologies. And I would say in general, non-consensual intimacies and relationships in general are kind of what that concept is trying to describe. And then Mingus offers access intimacy as a concept that comes from transformative justice. And the idea is that when we build relationships and have strong reciprocal relationships with each other, we start to understand one another's access needs. And in that context, it becomes appropriate sometimes to even anticipate them. And so it's the feeling of, she says, it's the feeling of my partner knows that I will be in chronic pain when this thing is happening. And so they kind of preempt that. Or in community, the idea that, these different access needs are going to exist. And so we're going to build access into our events. For example, like this event has live captioning, it has ASL. And to name that as a way that we can share love and hospitality and generosity with one another, even if we don't know each other on quite an intimate personal level.
Thank you. I have a couple of other questions too, but I don't want to be hogging the mic. You mentioned the word love, Amy, so I'm wondering for all of you, and we haven't talked about love too much or definitions of it, and we might not have the same definition, but where does love come into thinking about how we deal with unsettling science? Is love a factor? And how? Or is there a better word? I mean, we're talking a lot about relationship, right? I actually am not using the word love very much in my own work and my sexualities work, but I'm interested to hear. And there's also a question in the chat too. I'm curious to hear more from Professor Miley about what it has been like interfacing with U of T astronomy astrophysics department since you started working here. I don't know, you might not want to answer that. Love or gossip at U of T astronomy.
Quickly comments on the question about what interfacing with the U of T astronomy and astrophysics department since I started working here, and I'll keep it brief. I have been doing informal and formal consultations with the department, as well as individual professors from their department acting in their capacity as U of T faculty, but also faculty at U of T's Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics that function ubiquitously within the kind of professional and academic communities of Canadian astronomy. And so I've kind of taken it in steps to do my due diligence to essentially demand that these institutions, these actors, and the federal government divest from the 30-meter telescope project. And in my work with them, I have made some amazing allies like Mi'kmaq astronomer Hilding Nielsen, who I mentioned earlier in my talk, that have staunchly advocated for Kanaka Maoli and argued against astro-colonialism at Mauna Kea. And on the flip side, I've also engaged with astronomers, astrophysicists, and other scientists that our conversations, which have come out in collective and individual spaces, unfortunately have centered on elephant in the room, which is whether or not Native Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli opposing the 30-meter telescope are human, because science ideas that are racist and colonial and feminizing about Indigenous peoples as being pre-modern and anachronistic and not modern and scientific. And so those conversations have been difficult because I've been engaging with folks through a kind of appeal institutionally to divest from the 30-meter telescope because the front lines are here too, while at the same time realizing that it is not these astronomers, it is not U of T, it is not the Canadian federal government that has stopped the 30-meter telescope. It is Kanaka Maoli, it is Kia'i, and it is the Mauna itself that has prevented TMT from being built.
Thank you. Somebody, Morel Ingram is saying, I appreciate the question about love, especially in the context of unsettling science. It is not one of the basic dividings of colonial science to separate feelings of care, or is it not one of the basic dividings to separate feelings of care, responsibility, and perhaps love from analysis, investigation, and understanding? And then there's another question. I would appreciate learning more from Dr. McLean about his career path and the challenges he's faced navigating settler colonial academia as a social scientist and biologist. What led you to develop your independent institute, DAT? Thank you to all the panelists for inspiring and fantastic panel. Shay-Akil, you want to say something?
Yes, and thank you for the question. Yeah, my career path has been interesting. Basically, I just kept getting kicked out everywhere I went. To be honest, like every PhD program I was in for, like, well, I got kicked out of 3 of them. But the point is, because I didn't want to do racist stuff. Let's just leave it at that. But given my experiences in academia as a graduate student, I started thinking about this towards the past like 2-3 years. I started realizing I don't like working for white people. And that's because when you work for white people, you don't really have any agency, and you don't actually really know if you have a job, because they can just literally take your life resource, the things you need for resources to live, like that. And I also realized I'm tired of fighting with them for with regards to trying to do the things that I know are necessary, required, and needed amongst my community members, and was needed amongst Indigenous peoples, period. And I'm not interested in having a conversation about it. It's not a discussion. It's not negotiable. And for that reason, I realized that ultimately, if I have to wonder if I have a job as an academic, formal academic in the Euro-Western sense, I'd rather bet on Black. I'd rather just work for myself. And what that provides me is a sense of autonomy to dictate the contractual terms upon which I will interact with or engage with an institution. And I did that really for the reason I want to be able to do the work that I'm passionate about and I care about, and that at the very least doesn't make the world worse than what it already is. And I also am not interested in decolonizing academia, honestly. Like, because what this is, it doesn't really, I'm not interested in this. Whatever this stuff is, they keep calling it, whatever. The structure of quote unquote academe is a problem. It's going to have to change, if not be destroyed, and then build something else. So I've been trying to be very, very intentional about finding other ways to do research. And that's the reason I just decided to move from doing just creating and designing political education tools and putting resources out there to just starting my own research institute, which is what I've been spending the past year doing. So at least in that sense, I can engage in different projects and with different communities and organizations, to where we do the work, we meet the need, and then disperse. Is because I'm also thinking in a sense to where thinking about how state surveillance operates, thinking about how people who are not interested in perpetuating Euro-Western colonialism were usually punished for not wanting to be awful on a consistent basis. So what are ways that we can create other spaces of care, and as well as just setting it up so that people don't necessarily have to have the same experiences that some of us had in academia and in getting our training and engaging in doing some of the scientific work. So that's really what ended up leading me to try to establish an independent institute. And otherwise, I'm just not interested in playing around with the whole concept of tenure track, because they just beat you up all over again. And I don't want that. I'm tired. That's really why I did it.
We might need a panel on, we've only got 38 seconds left, but a panel on that topic, right? For junior scholars, I think would be really interesting. And it doesn't have to be a panel. It can be something you do through your organization, Shayakil. So I'm going to call attention to one final thing, and maybe we can think about it. People are, there's also a comment about love and rage as two affects that often animate our interventions for justice in science and elsewhere in the ways that they alternately sustain and exhaust us. And I think that's a good kind of place to leave us, thinking about the balance between love and rage, right? They're both really legitimate approaches to what we're doing. And thank you, everybody, for coming. See you soon, I hope. Have a great evening.